Good evening, everyone. I'll call our meeting to order at 6:34 this evening. Paisepka, Konaselas, Kaki, Patanaqueo, Disia Talatash, Snanamok, Mustimok, Nihakwashasta, Tamak, Atanaqueo. Thank you all for gathering here. I give my highest gratitude to the people of Snanamok, on whose territory I am currently hosting this meeting on. Acknowledging that we also serve within the Staminas and Snanawas First Nations, alongside the Mid-Island Métis Nation, as well as our Inuit relatives. Are there any additions, deletions, or change in order to the agenda?
Can I make a request for an addition, please?
Sure.
It's about 6.4. I actually just have some questions. So whether we do it at that time or move it to new business, it's up to you.
Questions on the correspondence?
Yes. On the content.
Oh, okay. So that would need to be added to new business 7.3.
Thank you.
B and A. Yep. Any other additions, deletions, or change in order? Not seeing any. So including the addition of 7.3, is there any objection to approving the agenda? Okay, the motion carries unanimously with the addition. That takes us to 6.1, correspondence. That the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, refer the above correspondence regarding before and after school childcare to the board chair for response. Is there a mover? Indicate so in the chat function. Been moved by Jessica, and a second by Chantel. Any discussion on that motion? With no discussion, I'll call the question. Is there anyone opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Takes us to 6.2. That the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, refer the above correspondence regarding environmental sustainability action plan to the board chair for response. Sarah Mover. Moved by Elaine and seconded by Chantel. Any discussion? With no discussion, I'll call the question. Is there anyone opposed to the motion? Motion carries unanimously. 6.3, that the Board of Education of School District number 68 refer the above correspondence from Down Syndrome of BC to staff for response. Sarah Mover. Moved by Chantel, seconded by Jessica. Any discussion on that motion? With no discussion, the motion carries unanimously. Thank you. 6.4, that the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, refer the above correspondence from D and A Mahoney to be received and filed. Is there a mover? Moved by Bill, seconded by Chantel. And we'll be discussing the content and of the letter in 7.3. Any discussion on this motion? I'll call the question. Is there any opposition? Motion carries unanimously. So 6.5, that the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, refer the above correspondence from L. Guilfoy to staff and board chair for response. Is there a mover? Moved by Naomi and seconded by Greg. Discussion on that motion? With no discussion, I'll call the question. Is there anyone opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. That takes us to 7.1, new business with Mark Walsh, Secretary Treasurer, on financial year end.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, board and viewers. So This evening, as per our usual process, this evening is to kind of give a quick summary of what the end of year looks like. Couple of notes here. This is the auditors have not come before the board yet. And so, of course, so this has got a bit of an asterisk that this is based on unaudited numbers, although it is complete, and they'll be before the board at the end of the month. So the other purpose of this is to give the board a couple of weeks to contemplate potential allocation of the surplus. So we haven't come up with specific proposals, staff proposals with respect to surplus usage here, but we will certainly bring this back to the business committee in 2 weeks' time, and then ultimately to the board at the end of the month for approval. So what we're looking at here, and keep in mind this is a slightly different report than previous years because our surplus policy has now changed. So you remember we used to call them buckets, where we had variety of places where money is put if it's surplus. And then now that's slightly shifted, and I'll go over that in just a moment. So overall, the news for our school district is very good. We ended the year with a surplus of approximately, so there's a couple of numbers to look at. So one of the numbers is $7.8 million. However, the reality of the kind of easily moved, not easily moved, but expendable dollars that are not have other commitments is approximately $2.7 million. So well within a reasonable range. We did see very happily spending happening at the school levels. So we saw some of the smallest carry forward or smallest surpluses at the school levels we've seen in a decade. So that message to spend today's dollars on today's kids is really getting down to the ground level there. Again, what accounts for some of the surplus will of course be coming to you at the end of the month to talk about it. But we did see, of course, we have some hiring lags, which were somewhat offset by the fact that we had higher than required absenteeism last year, higher than budgeted absenteeism. Of course, the international program came in well over budget. And, you know, as we saw that, we were able to staff and support them and had maybe a little bit of funds left over that we couldn't put into staffing because there wasn't space, so the timetables couldn't be redone at that point. So there's a couple of positives there, as well as prudent budgeting. We do often come with departmental surpluses because folks are pretty careful. Rarely do you see a overspend in learning services, or the secretary treasurer superintendent's office or the human resources, etc. It gets pretty close, but at the same time we are very careful and prudent with what we spend. The other thing, of course, is last year there still was a time when we didn't have the opportunity to do some of those things together or away from the city. So you might not have seen the same kind of professional development spends that we would have in previous years, of course, as well. So that's some of the surplus. One thing I'll say that you will not see in this document necessarily, except for the fact that it talks about our capital, local capital balance, is that some of the expenditures that the board put forward last September have not necessarily been fully implemented. And so we'll have some capital balances to continue with our implementation of gardens, environmental projects, etc. And so there's an example of where, because of many different competing priorities and a lot of capital dollars from a variety of places, from childcares to environmental funding to annual facilities grant, we did end up not spending all those dollars. And the good news is, of course, is those projects are still in motion, but our local capital balance is a little bit higher than it normally would be because of that. So I will maybe turn to page 67 of the agenda and talk about the buckets, the new buckets, or the new pots of dollars. So our first area is restricted surplus reserve for anticipated unusual circumstances. So I guess this would be the known unknowns, to go back to the early 2000s reference. But what we have here is, you'll see in the previous year, we've lowered that number significantly. So we've always held back this $1.5 million budget, and that was in case we had an unanticipated decline in enrollment, an unanticipated denial of our classroom enhancement fund request to the ministry, something along that lines. And so typically that rolls over and it was a bit of our rainy day fund. Well, the ministry's new requirements and the board's new policy say, don't just put money that you don't think you're going to spend, or at least there's a good possibility you're going to spend in that pot. So looking at that past, we brought that number down to something a little bit more reasonable. And so when again you look at that staffing reserve, the explanation is on page 68, and then replacement costs again. I think I heard it described as folks are being invited to be sick, and of course to call in when they're being encouraged to call in when they are not healthy enough to come to work, which is great, but there is a significant cost to us, and so we set aside numbers in the preliminary budget, which will cover the Employment Standards Act. But when we did our year-end final, with respect to how last year went from a sick leave provision, we thought that it's probably appropriate to put a little bit more in there. And so at Q1, we'll be able to come back and say, okay, well, is that number appropriate? At Q2, we'll get a really good sense of where we're on track. And so that doesn't mean that the 400,000 needs to sit there if it's not being used, but certainly protects the board's interest and is significantly lower than previous years with respect to that kind of staffing piggy bank, so to speak. Then the restricted surplus. This is something you see year to year, but I think it's important that we do look through these because there's a lot less than there was last year. So the restricted surplus is money that is set aside for very specific purposes. So the district benefit premium balance, last year we had a significant balance that we drew down to focus on board priorities. And what we did was we said, okay, well, let's go with what the kind of industry standard reasonable number to be in the premium balance is. And so we brought that number down from 5.6 to 2.5, and we feel that that's appropriate. So that technically could be spent down to zero. However, if our benefits charges go up at some point, we are getting more employees, if usage changes, that surplus disappears incredibly quickly. And so this is kind of a prudent number, which is lower than it's probably been in many years, but a prudent number. Undelivered POs, and apologies for the acronym, so purchase order. And so what that means is we took advantage of purchasing a lot of technology kind of March, April, May, June, in a little bit anticipation of inflation, but also in anticipation of supply chain issues. And so what happened was we ordered them. Here's $563,000, not all of that, but most of that. And then it just didn't get delivered by July 1st. So the vast majority of them are here and online or getting ready to go to schools right now. But that is that number. So the money is now out the door. It's just for the purposes of our financial statements, it still was in existence on June 30. Indigenous education programs, you'll see good news there. We're trying to make sure we don't have a big surplus going year to year. So, but it's very, very typical that we've had some trouble spending that to zero. But we did drop it a little bit this year. So that's positive, but that's money that the board can't reallocate. That's targeted funding from the ministry. Teacher mentorship grants. So this really is controlled by the union, and I assume that probably due to COVID related issues, our inability to replace folks, etc., that's why that number really stands out as significant still. School supplies. This is the school number I noted. So if you go back to 2012, I think the number was over 300,000. And so we're now at a place where we're not carrying forward those significant numbers. So there's a little bit left in many of our schools, but not a lot. So that really shows that schools focused on spending on last year's kids. Outreach program, this is also expended. The board supported this in the budget. It was used in July and August, and now it is gone. Seamless Day pilot, we had to move that money forward just because it didn't get off the ground last year. And so again, targeted funding. And then health and safety, just the reality, here's an inflationary impact. We have to do an asbestos requirements for WorkSafe, and it just costs more, and we hadn't budgeted in the preliminary budget. So we put it in restricted because it's not really one that the board has a ton of options to support. You'll see the rest of those. We're not suggesting that they proceed as surplus expenditures. I will note that we may come in 2 weeks with a small request for bargaining support because we still have local QP bargaining to do, and so you may see that in 2 weeks. So restricted surplus reserve for operations spanning multiple school years. We have not pursued money in this. So this is new. This is the 3-year planning idea. And so the board invested in spring, you'll recall, in the preliminary budget in that, the new program that'll be operating out of Dufferin. Theoretically, we could have put something like that here, but let's assume that the board has a 3-year goal to improve literacy rates, but for 3 kids in grade 3 and 4, and it's a 3-year program and you want to see how it goes after. You set aside one-time money and then you just carry it forward year to year. It's your way to track that the money's getting used for that purpose. And then of course it just disappears at the end, or it gets rolled into the budget if the desire is there. So at the end of the day, that again, you'll see the internally restricted appropriated by the board, which is again what we're saying is the 4073880 and the million. So still needs board approval, to be clear. Some things board doesn't have a lot of options with. And then the unrestricted surplus being 2.7. We have already, though, we're going to be proposing in 2 weeks' time a $2 million transfer to local capital out of that 2.7. And we'll have more opportunity and more rationale in a couple of weeks, and happy to answer questions when the proposal actually comes forward. The idea, though, is if you recall back in spring, we purposefully did not include the yearly transfer to local capital for technology. And so what we thought was, well, why would we tell the board that we need to either cut a program or not support a new program focused on students when we can see a surplus is coming? So let's wait and let's spend the money now in the preliminary budget and wait until fall to invest into our local capital to support technology. And so that's what that is. So if we didn't put the million in, then we are going to be facing some serious maintenance issues in a year's time, 2 years' time, etc. So that's that. Essentially, it's kind of a deferred. We would have done it in the normal budget in a normal year, but because we wanted to spend money on kids right away, that's what the proposal was. The other transfer is contemplating both potentially Ladysmith intermediate and potentially a contribution to what ND would look like if we were going to be getting support for it. So depending on the nature of those projects and what we seek to do, and expansion is a great example, we will be expected to contribute, particularly to expansion. Maybe not to seismic, but if the higher cost option is the option the board wants, we will be expected to contribute. And so since particularly Ladysmith is realistic, at least the next stages are realistic, we thought that it's important that the board contemplate moving to local capital as a message to the ministry that we're serious about getting these projects done, but also the reality that we're going to be expected to have some support. So, which leaves if again, it's going to be subject to board approval, which leaves 744,480. I am just going to highlight that we do intend to bring a proposal with respect to heightened cleaning still, elevated cleaning levels to support cleaning for health is one area that we anticipate, and we're having a discussion about a couple of other areas as well. Finally, we'll highlight that we are concerned about inflation. And so what you saw coming out of the ministry on Monday was a great announcement where we're going to be getting $1.45 million to support inflation that's impacting families. We don't have it on the agenda tonight because we're really not prepared to talk about how that might flow. So I know there's probably lots of questions, and that's probably better for a later meeting. But one of the things to point out about that funding is it's not intended to support inflationary pressures for the district. It's intended to do inflationary pressures for families. So as obviously it's going to be impacting our schools, but for instance, if we had exempt salaries or principal salaries or other things like that that the board hasn't budgeted sufficiently for, and all of a sudden, they often mimic the teacher increase or QP increase, etc., we might not have the funds set aside to be able to support that. So we don't know those numbers yet, but it's nice to be in a position to be able to potentially support inflationary expenses. But again, we don't know them all yet. So that is the fairly high level summary of where we're at. Again, it's going to come back to business. It's with recommendations and come back to the board for hopefully vote and passage along with the financial statements and the auditor.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Do we have any questions on this presentation at this point? Probably have lots more questions in a couple of weeks. Jessica?
Thank you. And thanks, Mark, for an excellent report. I had a number of questions written down and you answered actually every single one. I just want to follow up on one aspect of it. And so one of my questions was, is if you could tell us a little bit from where the surplus came. And you gave us a number of options and explanations on that. I'm just wondering if you can just tell us a little bit more about the areas that we had a surplus come from.
Sure, and if it's okay, if I could be maybe prepared to answer that in a bit more deep depth at the business committee and take that away, I'd appreciate that.
Perfect, thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. I think that
sorry, I was going to say just one thing to point out is on page 67, you'll see under the capital fund that increase in local capital from year to year. That's the surplus with respect to the underspend I was talking about on the capital side. But we will have, the departments were doing this, and the schools did this, and international did this, etc.
Okay, great, thank you. That finishes up 7.1. We can move on to 7.2, appointment of election officials. You, Mark.
So this is, we think, pro forma, just for the requirement for the board to appoint chief electoral officer. So as you recall, the election's coming on up very quickly here. We are not doing a ton of the work here at the board office, so the actual heavy lifting of ballots, etc., is going, except for in one area, is going to be done by our municipal and regional district partners. But at the same time, we are still required to have a chief electoral officer. And the deputy, of course, so would be myself and Karen Matthews. So we would be accepting the nomination forms, providing the nomination forms, answering some basic questions, likely communicating with candidates if the municipalities have concerns about various issues, etc.
Okay, great. Is there a trustee that would like to move the recommendation? Perhaps I'll start by reading it. So there's a motion that the Board of Education of School District number 68, and I'm a Ladysmith, appoint Secretary Treasurer Mark Walsh as the Chief Election Officer and Manager, and Manager Administrative Services Karen Matthews as the Deputy Chief Election Officer pursuant to Section 58(1) of the Local Government Act. That's been moved by Jessica and seconded by Chantel. Is there any discussion on that motion? With no discussion, the motion carries unanimously. Thank you. And that takes us to 7.3. So maybe what I'll do is ask Jessica to come on screen and raise this discussion for us.
Trying to come on screen, the camera button doesn't want to seem to work. So, oh, there we go. And well, first I'll take the opportunity for Ms. Mahoney, I think is how you say her name. I thought it was an excellent letter, and very much appreciate that perspective. And the data nerd in me got very excited. And I thought her points were valid, but I'm also very aware, it made me realize that as a board, we've often asked for data, and that we often ask for information that will help us evaluate various programs, and that needs to be presented in various forms like graphs. But I'm recognizing that I am coming from a privileged position of having taken graduate courses in statistics, and so I speak this language, and I just felt that I needed to ask the question is if we've given our staff the professional development, or if we've thought about that piece of ensuring that our staff have the training to provide us with accurate presentations of data and interpretations of data. If we've kind of followed up on that, and just because as a board, it's something we've really been pressing, but I just wanted to make sure that we were giving our staff the support to do it accurately.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Mark, go ahead.
Well, I can say from the superintendent sets a culture of professional development more broadly, and so we as senior staff have growth plans that have areas that that we individually want to focus on, as well as what the district needs are. And so, say on the one hand, there's lots of opportunity for professional development. With respect to statistical analysis, I have not taken that, and I can't speak to whether folks that report to me have or not. What I will say, though, is with respect to the kind of specific issues that were raised, we're very alive to both the benefits and the problems with the various systems that we use. And I will say that, you know, particularly with the criticisms associated with Baragar, is, you know, they're fairly rough numbers, which is why we use both Baragar and an external GIS group to determine what we believe projections are going to be in 2030. And to be fair to Baragar is that, you know, local knowledge is fairly fundamental in order for the system to have an effective mechanism to predict what's going to happen in a decade. It's really good for a year, it's really good for 2, 10 years out. If you don't tell it where it's going to be growing, it can be a bit more difficult, which is what we think we've cured with the direction that we went with the long-range facilities plan. We didn't, you know, go with a, you know, the variance, the confidence variance. We didn't really think about it, but we did kind of put an asterisk to our numbers saying economic change might change this, you know, development realities might change this, family dynamics might change this, affordability might change this. So our plan all along has actually been to give those numbers a couple of years and rerun the numbers to see if, number one, the development is happening, and number two, the assumptions that we made, because remember the production of the number of children per housing unit was an assumption we made off of kind of the current lived, you know, kind of current numbers and what kind of housing produces the number of kids. So this is the year that we were actually intending to go back to see how we're doing. And I can tell you already, it's likely that our numbers are going to be a little bit lower projections than they were when we did it 2 years ago. Or just slightly softer, not a ton softer, but slightly softer. So our intention is more to go back to that consultant and have them run through the process, having already done it with our instructions that make a lot of sense to us, and then come back to the board.
Great.
Thanks.
Did
Can
you
I
have a
follow up?
Yep.
Yes, I do. So I think, so thanks, Mark. And I know that we've done some really impressive work about kind of modifying our data sources and trying to get better answers to our questions. I just realized with this letter, or made me realize that as a board, we are asking staff to provide us with information. And I guess I want to throw it out there that I just want to make sure that the staff have the training or someone to say, hey, you know, how is it that you accurately create a graph to communicate the information? Just so we weren't putting them and asking them to do something that they didn't have in their background. So I just was a little bit worried that I just wanted to make sure that we were supporting our staff to do the jobs that we were asking them to do. And although a data analyst wrote a letter that somebody else who has data analytic training was able to go, hey, this is really interesting. And made me realize that not that you need to be a data analyst. I'm not expecting that, but it might be useful for some of our staff members who are put in the position of having to communicate that, just to have some support, whether it's professional development or, you know, someone in our district that they can go ask a question. I just wanted to kind of throw that idea out there because the points in the letter were great points. So thank you to the letter writer. Thank you for the staff for ongoing, always trying to do better. This was just one where I was like, I just want to make sure that we've got you know, some backup for our staff members, because I know we're putting a lot of requests from the board onto them, and I just want to make sure they've got that. So thanks.
Great. Thank you. Are there any other questions on 7.3? I don't see any further questions, so I'll be looking for a motion to adjourn. That's been moved by Naomi and seconded by looking for a trustee to second that motion. Chantel? Is there anyone opposed? With no one opposed, the motion, or pardon me, the motion carries and we're adjourned at 7:06. Thanks, everyone.